Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Matt Zakreski, and I am here to talk to you today about trying to fill a black hole, how to raise gifted and neurodivergent children. Um, if you're watching this, everybody calls me Dr. Matt. I'm a clinical psychologist and neurodiversity expert. Um, and this is one of my favorite talks to give because while a lot of the focus we put on gifted and neurodivergent kids is obviously in school, then they eventually come home, and we need the strategies to help doing that. So, um, we're going to understand the neuropsychology of giftedness. We're going to process some of the typical challenge behaviors. We're going to talk about some skills. And most importantly, I want you to feel supported by this and access some more resources to feel supported by the community. Um, if we were in person, we would talk about how we want to be respectful for each other and maintain confidentiality. A little bit less important when we're doing a recording, but it just is a general rule. Just because it hasn't worked for you doesn't mean it can't work for another parent. Everybody's on their own journey. So, let's assume positive intent and try and be collaborative in nature. So, story time. So, when I was 8 years old, my parents took me to the Connecticut Children's Museum, which is pictured here. Um, they wanted to show me some of the science exhibits, and so my parents and my sisters and me wandered around the museum. Now, at one point, we got to a display that was all about hydroelectric power, and water was running down a slight slope and being sent through some water wheels, which would power a small generator. And everybody oohed and awed, and they moved on. About an hour later, my parents looked down to point something else out to me and realized that I am no longer with them. Every parent's worst nightmare, right? You're in the museum and your child is gone. So they quickly backtracked through the museum and they found me back at the hydroelectric um, display, having taken my shoes and socks off, rolled my pants up to my knees, and I was standing in the pool at the bottom of the slide fixing the hydroelectric power because clearly they had made it inefficiently. And my parents looked at each other and they looked at me and they looked at the poor security guard who was trying desperately to talk me out of the water. And they thought, well, there's no playbook for a kid like this. And as a fun side note, my mom and dad are both clinical child psychologists. So I tell you this story because raising gifted kids is hard. There is challenges that you will not anticipate that other families will not have to deal with, like breaking into a hydroelectric display at a museum. So it's important as we anchor this conversation to think about some of the myths about raising gifted kids. You know, Primary to our conversation today is that gifted kids are easy. They sit there with their hands folded and they look straight ahead and they answer questions and they're like little adults and they make our lives easier. Now, gifted kids are absolutely capable of being those people. But there's a lot more going on there under the hood. And the more we fall victim to the myths of raising gifted kids or any kids, then it's shifting our perspective in a way that doesn't serve us and more importantly, doesn't serve our children. When you're a parent, there's a lot of pieces to it. Love, boundaries, providing safety, providing support, giving them access to opportunities, whether that's driving to soccer practice or taking a vacation or going to local community theater shows or something as simple as, okay, we're buying Netflix without ads. All of those things represent access to opportunities. We teach them, we help them grow, we meet their needs, and most importantly, we raise the kids we have, not the kids we wish we had. Now, every parent goes through their own version of this story. Every parent goes through a mourning process of, I thought my kid was going to be X. And sometimes your kid is Y. Sometimes your kid is B or C or Q. And we're not always prepared to raise those kids. Now, we love them and we're there, we're not going anywhere. But it can take time to understand what it's like to raise a kid that was not what you saw. I think about a kid I worked with many years ago. She's, unbelievably talented engineer, really beautiful, like STEM brain. And I remember her dad, he's like, I didn't finish high school. Dr. Matt, like I'm a mechanic. Well, like how did I get this brilliant kiddo who's, going to win a Fields medal someday? And I said, well, we raise the kids we have, not the kids we thought we were going to have. But, also it's important to remember that giftedness can look like a lot of different things across generations. Dad wasn't just an auto mechanic. He had won, mechanic of the year in his county several years in a row. I mean, he was a top of the line 99th percentile auto mechanic, right? So, talent speaks to talent, even if the talent it does different things. So, as we anchor this in neuroscience a little bit, a neurotypical brain is something that operates largely within normal expected parameters. It does what we think brains are supposed to do. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of people are neurotypical, right? So most of people are that. And society is built for these people and by these people. This puts neurodivergent people whose brains process, learns, and behave differently outside the norm. So we are, outliers by nature. And neurodiversity is all the brains in the world. So sometimes you'll see someone interchange the words neurodivergent and neurodiversity. They are different terms. And it's also important to remember that neurodivergent doesn't just mean autism, right? It means all different kinds of brains, gifted, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's. We'll go through more terms later. So this understanding of neurodiversity turns into a neurodiversity movement. Neurodiversity is the idea that there is no right way of thinking, learning, or behaving, right? That all ways of doing things have strengths and are valid in their own way. The differences that people display are not deficits. And this is probably the heart of the neurodiversity movement because it's so much more than just how do we fix these kids? It's okay, just because you do it differently doesn't mean it's worse. I can try and help you do it better, but I'm not trying to fix you. I'm trying to help you add skills. Um, this term is often, associated with the Australian sociologist Judy Singer. And over time, the neurodiversity movement has really turned into a social justice movement. This idea that people deserve accommodations at home, at school, at work, in the community. I travel a lot around as a professional speaker, and I cannot tell you how many more sensory friendly rooms I see in airports now than I did even 5 years ago. And that just makes my heart happy because it's like we are moving in the right direction, however slowly it might take. So, as we said, here's all the pieces of the neurodiversity rainbow. You know, a lot of things on here that you've probably covered. One important thing to note about neurodiversity is that one neurodivergence predicts others at a much higher level. So, if you're a kiddo with ADHD, you are much more likely to have Tourette's. If you're a person with OCD, you're much more likely to be on the autism spectrum. So, a different brain predicts other differences and high levels. And the terms we use for these things can overlap in some ways. And as we get a more nuanced understanding of the brain, we're starting to realize how much these things have in common with each other. I mean, it wasn't until very recently that you could be diagnosed with autism and ADHD. They used to be rule outs for each other. If you're autistic, you couldn't have ADHD. If you're ADHD, you couldn't be autistic. Now we know, well, actually, those are very different things. And we can look at brain scans and say that this is a brain that has both of those things. So, you know, the psychological model was based off the medical model where it's like, hey, I have a broken wrist. My wrist is broken. Look at my wrist is broken. What we know now is mental health wise, those lines are not as clearly drawn, which means our diagnostic process has to be a little bit more flexible by nature. So, one of the biggest signs of a neurodivergent person is what we call asynchronous development. So a neurotypical person develops synchronously. So if you're 10 years old and you're neurotypical, you're basically 10 years old in everything you do. There might be some variation, but more or less, you're 10 years old. When you're neurodivergent, the brain grows up in a different way. And because there's only so much energy to go around, some parts of the brain get a lot more, some parts of the brain get a lot less. And what we see over here on the right is a common profile of a neurodivergent person, someone who has incredibly advanced skills intellectually and in terms of their special talent, age appropriate skills in some things like social skills, and lower than chronological age expectations in fine motor skills and emotional skills. So, what this means is that you've got a kiddo who's 10 in everything if they're neurotypical, but their 12-year-old neurodivergent sibling, well, they might be 12 chronologically, but they're 17 intellectually, 16 academically, 11 in fine motor skills, 10 emotionally, and 6 socially. And to truly meet the needs of this kiddo, you cannot just intervene in one place. You have to intervene in all 5 areas of development. And my mentor, the great Dr. Jean Peterson, she always called this the rule of 5. That every gifted kid really is 5 kids because that's asynchrony in action. So if you're listening to this presentation and you're thinking to yourself, like, I only have 2 children, why am I so exhausted? Well, first off, there is no such thing as only 2 kids. But most importantly, by the rule of 5, you have 10 children. So say that to Debbie in the pickup line and see how she feels. And most importantly, when it comes to asynchrony, is the idea that we tend to have our expectations drift upwards as our children become more impressive, and we tend to level set our expectations for them on the highest abilities they have. And whenever you're going to intervene with a neurodivergent kid, it's always important to stop and remind yourself of the kid's chronological age. Because, yes, your 9-year-old who sometimes speaks like a US senator, you tend to drift upwards like in maturity and focus. And look how capable this kid is a lot of the time. That is absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that your 9-year-old isn't still 9. And sometimes 9-year-olds do stupid things because that's what kids do. Kids are kids. So a lot of times parents will say to me, like, well, he's so capable, she's so capable, they're so capable, and all these things. And that's great. We want to meet them where they are in those levels. But let's not also forget how old a kid is because the chronological age is a very different set of expectations and rules than their functional age. So while there are many different areas we could focus on in terms of how to best meet the needs of neurodivergent kids, I'm going to focus on 4 for this presentation today: executive dysfunction, communication differences, emotional regulation, and community connection. So let's talk about executive dysfunction. This is also one of my favorite memes of all time. So executive dysfunction comes from our prefrontal cortex, right here in the front part of our head. The prefrontal cortex does many things for us: planning, follow through, organization, task initiation, task completion, self-regulation, time management, sustaining attention, all these things. Vitally for our conversation today is the prefrontal cortex's job is to do behavioral inhibition, is to stop a behavior before it starts, to read the room and say, should I be doing this thing that I'm doing? Now, sometimes that's as innocuous as I didn't think anybody was looking at me when I picked my nose. And sometimes it's everybody at this room is sad and quiet because we're at a funeral, and your kid turns to you and goes, "Can I play Pokemon Go? This is boring." So we need to move our brains from the neurodivergent ready, fire, aim to more of a neurotypical ready, aim, fire. And the tricky thing about having a neurodivergent brain is our brains are made up of neurons, and the neurons function as superhighways. Information is whipping through our brain to the front part of our brain here, and it needs to triage and sort it. So our prefrontal cortex sort of operates like an air traffic controller. It's got to sort of say, you go, you go, you wait, you wait, you go, you wait, you need to come in immediately. We're always triaging, we're always level setting. And when your prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, as it is in almost every kind of neurodivergence, you can struggle with putting things in lists and putting things in order, because you can see here in this picture, all these trucks are trying to get out of this depot, and they've all gotten jammed up at the back part here because there's nobody saying to these trucks, okay, well, you should go here and you should wait, and then you should go, and then you should wait, and then you should go. It kind of looks like those old Three Stooges episodes where all three Stooges were trying to walk through a door at the same time and they all get stuck. Like, a lot of times when kids are stuck, I tell them it doesn't matter what you do first, as long as you do something. Every time you do something, it's got that positive behavioral momentum behind it. So the way this works is that all cognitive controls, including executive functioning, use a lot of energy. We gain information, we retain it, and we relay that information. The brain supplies energy for this process using dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that has excitatory effects on our neurons. That dopamine creates what we call a microcircuit. You need dopamine to get tasks done, but you gain more dopamine for completing them. So, if you woke up this morning and you brushed your teeth, let's say that cost you 4 dopamine to brush your teeth, but you get 6 dopamine for brushing your teeth. So you end up +2. This is a really important thing because the dopamine we gain or add for doing things creates a surplus where we can pull from to do tasks. Part of the reason our kids get so burned out is that they're doing a lot of things that are low dopamine rewards. So, doing a 50-minute math test is going to cost you 1,000 dopamine and might get you 800 dopamine. So you're ending up 200 dopamine less. And when you run that dopamine deficit, that's where you see things like kids starting to burn out. That's where you start to see that after school restraint collapse because your kids are using so much dopamine to just get through the damn day. And when they come home and they walk through the front door, they collapse, right? Usually in some meltdown or tears or something like that. So we need to find a way to add more dopamine into the day, give them more rewards, help them feel better about what they're doing. So they're running that surplus so they have more energy to do more things. And all of these things that occur come from a, a developmental pathway that we see in the brain that puts our kids at a bit of a deficit. So we know the neurotypical brain's prefrontal cortex, it's always the prefrontal cortex is always the last part of the brain to develop. In neurotypical kids, it develops somewhere between 20 and 25. So it's fully coming online in your early 20s. In your neurodivergent kids, we can add as much as a decade, sometimes 15 years to that developmental process. So what you see is that these kids are intellectually and perhaps achievement wise ready to enter their 20s and start to be adults. But in terms of development and doing the things they need to do, like living with a roommate or paying their bills on time or figuring out how to commute to work, are all things that they are going to be less able to do well because of how their brains have developed. One strategy we can use to help give instructions to kids with executive functioning deficits is called the Scooper technique. The Scooper technique is a 7-step process, and you're not going to have to do all 7 steps every time. But in a situation like this, it's a good way. Like if your kids aren't listening to you, it's a good way to sort of get them started again. So step 1, go to the same place. Don't yell across the house. Step 2, give clear instructions. Know what you want before you ask for it. I can't tell you how many times I see parents like, "Hey, listen to me," and the kid says, "What?" And parents are like, "Oh, Gus, I didn't think you'd actually listen to me." So know what you want to do first. Give the kids instructions, and then have them give it to you one more time. Have them repeat it. So I need you to go get your soccer bag from my car. What do I want you to do? Go get my soccer bag from your car. Great. On time, set a time limit. The sooner the better, because all neurodivergent kids have this sort of time blindness where it's like 2 times exist right now and the thing I like to call the magical land of later. So in the magical land of later, I'll do it then. So your kid can say, I'm going to do my homework at 2 a.m. because they're right. That is later, but it's not later in a way that serves us. Then we're going to perform the task. You do the thing. You evaluate that performance. If you did good, you move on to reward. If you didn't go on, fix it. So the P and E can repeat several times. Um, but once they've performed it appropriately, you reward them. The reward does not have to be a brand new car. It doesn't need to be a pony. It can be a high five. It can be a fist bump. It could be a tally mark. Something, you grab a Skittle from the candy jar. But to get that dopamine pathway engaged, we want to make sure we are rewarding the behavior we want to see. One other thing that's helpful for a lot of our kids is they're bad at triaging things, so they sort of put things off. They'll say like, "Well, I'll do it later." And I'll do it later. But then if you spend all day saying I'm going to do things later, then it's 8 p.m. and you have to do 3,000 things and you're exhausted and overwhelmed and you shut down because it's too much stuff to do. So I always try to tell my kids the mindset of Ohio, only handle it once. So if someone sends you an email and you could respond to that email right now, respond to it right now. If your partner says, "Hey, pick up milk on the way home from work," you can't solve that right now, but you can put that reminder in your phone. So when you leave at 5 o'clock, you're going to get the reminder, pick up milk on the way home. So only handle it once. The less you have to hold in your brain and your working memory, the less you have to remember. So, you know, if you, you know, if you knock your books behind your cabinet, get them now. If busted your sandal walking home from dinner, order another sandal now. Like, because otherwise it's going to go into that pile of things that we mean to do every day and we never do, which stresses us out more and then keeps us from getting it done. So try and only handle it once. All right. Then we get into communication styles and differences. So our goal here is to help kids get into what we call pro-social communication. Pro-social communication is not, the goal is not to be nice. Nice is a situation where I only care about your needs. I don't care about mine. So what happens is that kids are nice, 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 but being nice sort of like wounds them. And sooner or later they get so wounded that they blast out, they're angry, and people go, "Whoa, they're so mean." So what we want to do is model pro-social communication. The idea here is that my needs matter and your needs matter. When I'm in person, I usually do this demo by, I'll walk into the audience and I'll take somebody's water bottle. I'm like, can I have your water bottle? And because people are raised to be nice, they're like, sure. I'm like, great. I take their water bottle. I'm like, did you want me to have your water bottle? They say no. I'm like, great. So let's run this back again. Can I have your water bottle? And they say no. I'm like, right. That's not nice, but it is pro-social, right? Because you're allowed to say no. It's your damn water bottle, right? There are other ways a person can get their needs met. They can go get their own water bottle. They can have a coffee. They can ask somebody to get them water. There's a million ways, but it puts us in a collaborative mindset. Um, Pro-social communication is also helpful because it allows us to adapt different styles and techniques of interaction for different situations. Neurodivergent people tend to be very what we call context independent. So they are who they are all the time, whether you're at a funeral or a pep rally or in a board meeting or at bar trivia, you're the same dude. One of the more adaptive social skills is the ability to be context dependent, adapt your behavior to what's going on in your life otherwise. So that's a thing that it's a skill that we need to develop. And it's to a certain extent this can be masking, that like sort of pretending you're not who you are. I prefer thinking about it through the lens of code switching, right? Because I know if I'm talking to my buddies at work and we're, having a coffee break, we're just chilling, I'm going to talk and act in one way. But if the CEO walks in, "Hey, like, can I join you guys for a cup of Joe?" I'm not going to keep talking the same way. I'm going to put on a different set of behaviors because the CEO is sitting with me and I want to impress that person. We're going to emphasize pragmatic communication, understanding that our kids are really good at understanding the dictionary definition of words, not so much the implied meaning of words. So, and like, especially as kids get older, you communication gets more nuanced, it gets more subtle, there's more shades of gray, and our kids tend to struggle with that sort of stuff. So, there's if you think about like, teenagers flirting, right? There's a big difference between like, "Oh my God, stop," and "stop." It's the same word, right? But how it's delivered implies two very different meanings, right? So helping kids to understand or at least be able to ask the questions to navigate those socially nuanced moments is a skill to be developed. And we're going to use communication skills around meta communication. So to me, meta communication is talking about talking. So, you know, I'll check in with somebody like, "Hey, can I check in with you right now?" I'm literally naming the thing I want to say rather than just cannonballing into the conversation like, "Hi, I'm worried about you." We can use metacommunication to set expectations. We can use it to ask for help. We can use it you know, to level set a conversation based on previous conversations. Like, hey, I know we've talked about this 1,000 times. I just wanted to talk to you one more time about this. You're acknowledging that there's a piece of this that you can use and it just helps the other person see that you're treating them with dignity and you understand their role in the conversation. You know, Whenever my wife or I are upset, we always start these conversations with, hey, do you need to vent or are you looking for solutions? That's metacommunication, right? Because I'm saying, what role do you want me to play? And most of the time, my wife's like, I just need to vent. I'm like, great. Takes the burden off of me to solve the problem. I get to sit there and listen. And if an idea comes up, I might use metacommunication again to say, hey, I have an idea. Do you mind if I give you an idea? Once again, using metacommunication to ask for that. So there's a lot of neuroscience behind social skills. It's a very complex part of the brain. We're using task managers. We're using goal-directed behavior. We are following other people through our mirror neurons. We're making plans and following through on those plans. It's social skills are a very complex piece of the brain, which is why so many kids struggle with them. We also want to model and support cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to switch between two or more different concepts. So the idea here is in school, you are in English class, and then the bell rings and you're supposed to get up and go to gym. Now, some kids can just say, oh, the bell rang, that's my code to switch into gym mode. Some kids do that well, some kids don't do that well. Some kids also are sitting there in ninth period being like, I'm supposed to be learning history right now, but I have soccer in an hour and I'm really excited about soccer. And they can't hold space for both things in their head. So we can teach the prefrontal cortex these executive functioning skills of cognitive flexibility because neurodivergent kids tend to have a snap judgment of something. This is how I feel about this thing. So because I feel this way about this thing, this is what I have to do. So a thought leads to a feeling, leads to a behavior. So if the thought is, Johnny doesn't like me, the feeling that comes up from that is, I'm angry at Johnny. And because I'm angry at Johnny, I'm going to behave towards Johnny like I'm angry at him. So that triangle completes. The challenge, though, for us is that Johnny might not actually be angry at us. Johnny might not have seen us in the hallway. Johnny might be having a tough day. There's a million potential explanations. So when we can help a kid say, yes, this could be true, but so could this, what we're using is cognitive flexibility to blunt the initial emotional impact and then spread that goodness out. One of the key terms here for managing these behaviors is the idea of intention versus impact. So this is a huge struggle for a lot of our kids because our kids are the masters of I didn't mean to. It's like, well, yeah, we know that, right? But that also doesn't change the fact that it happened, right? So imagine if you're throwing a baseball back and forth to somebody. I throw it to you, you catch it. You throw it to me, I catch it. I throw it to you, you catch it. You throw it back to me, I miss catching it. The ball hits me in the nose and breaks my nose. Now I've got blood gushing all over the place right now, and that's not how I planned on spending my Tuesday. And you rush up to me, you're like, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to. Well, sure, it doesn't change the fact that my nose is broken. So intention matters, but impact matters more. And that's challenging for a lot of kids because once we do a behavior, once we release an action into the universe, we no longer have control over how it's perceived or how it's taken or how it ages. And all we can say is that I understand the impact of my actions. Can I please explain to you what my intention was behind this? Because once people feel seen in how they've been impacted by your choices, they are much more willing to listen to you about what you meant to do. One other strategy here that I think is really helpful, and I use this with my own kids all the time, is what I like to call the supervillain test. So the supervillain test is, let's say your kid's out there and they're using screens, right? They're playing Minecraft, they're on YouTube, and they're calm. They're doing what they're supposed to do. Now, you know that if you didn't say anything to them, they would stay calm and quiet all day. And that would allow you to get some things done as a grown-up. That's great. However, you also know that your kid needs to move their bodies and eat food and use the bathroom and talk to their friends and do a million other things. So the idea here is this is a way to have a conversation with your kid that anticipates some of their frustrations or hesitations and allows you to build in context around what you're asking them to do. So one way to think about it is, they're using that screens example from before. Your kiddo's like, I'm upset. I'm angry. I don't like feeling this way. So you're like, okay, I know that you don't want to turn off the screens. And I know that you're calmer when you're on screens. And you know that I know that too. So if both of us know that you'd be calmer and happier to play video games all day, and I still asked you to go outside and run around, I must have a pretty good reason to ask you to do that. Either that or I'm a supervillain, right? And it's one of those things, it's absurd enough that you can get kids like engaged with you on it because kids will be like, of course you're a supervillain, mom. Like, yes, I know, right? But it's saying like you're not being capricious, you're not being arbitrary. You're saying like, yes, everybody's calmer this way, but we cannot watch ESPN from 8 a.m. till noon on a Saturday. You at some point you've got to go out and do something else with your body. So it anticipates their argument and says, like, yes, I see these things in you. Here's why I want you to do other things as well. And this comes into an idea of what we call third door solutions. Now, we know neurodivergent kids like to be in control. One of the ways they control things is they try to put us in situations where there's a zero sum game, right? Either they win or we win. I call this you either give up or give in, right? Your kid's like, I won't eat any vegetables. I won't eat any vegetables. And you're like, well, you got to eat some vegetables. It feels like, well, damn, like either they win this or I win this. And I always tell my clients, if you find yourself in a situation where you're arguing with your kid, you've kind of already lost. So it's okay to compromise with your kids and find that third solution, that other entry, but do so with intention. The idea here is that if your kid doesn't want to eat vegetables and you want them to eat vegetables, one thing you could do is say, all right, listen, I need you to eat something healthy. I would prefer a vegetable. If you're not getting any vegetables right now, are you willing to eat fruit? Are you willing to eat yogurt? Is there a different kind of vegetable you'd want to eat? And kid's like, well, I won't eat that broccoli, but I mean, baby carrots are fine. So then we have the baby carrots, right? It's showing your kid that, like, hey, yes, I hear you. I see you. Your preferences matter. But also, I'm the adult and I need you to listen to me around the general task of what we're trying to do. So the context of these things is always vital, but it's going to help you step out of a lot of these arguments with your kids. Then we get into emotional regulation. So I have this picture here of a thumb because the thumb is the size of your amygdala in your brain. Amygdala is the source of fight or flight emotions. In many neurodivergent people, particularly autistic and gifted folks, the amygdala can be up to twice as large. So if you take something small and double it, part of the reason gifted people have such big feelings is because the part of their brain that does that is literally larger. So you're going to see a lot of research and resources out there that say that the best way to intervene with emotional kids is to help them calm down. And sure, but that's easier said than done, right? One thing it's important to know is that you don't need to be calm to calm somebody else down. You just need to be aware of your emotions. This is called co-regulation. Co-regulation is using your emotions to help somebody else regulate theirs. Now, it's important to know that this isn't about blaming the kid for your emotions. Like, I'm angry because you're being a jerk. It's not that. It's, I'm feeling really frustrated right now. How are you feeling? Because when one person names their feeling, it creates a situation where other people can talk about their feelings. Now, sometimes our kids aren't going to say how they feel directly. That is kind of how kids work. So it's important to remember where what we call the difference between content and process. Neurodivergent kids will give you 37,000 reasons why they can't do a thing. I can't go to grandma's house because I don't like that part of town and they have a dog and they're too close to the ocean and their Wi-Fi sucks and I don't like their couches and. Now, if you tried to respond to every piece of that content, you would be playing like argument whack-a-mole. You'd be in that room slapping down their arguments forever. And you're not really connecting with your kid. You're arguing. So one helpful thing is to sort of step out of what they're saying and try and hold a space for why do I think this person is saying all these things to me in this way right now? Usually they're trying to communicate some other emotion. And I'll say to my clients in therapy, like, listen, you've spent the last 10 minutes telling me you don't want to go to prom. You've given me all these reasons, including like, the situation in Darfur. I mean, like, clearly you don't want to go. Tell me more about why you don't want to go. I'm stepping into the process. We're using our words to communicate a feeling. I am much more interested in what that feeling is because when I understand the feeling, it makes me much more able to help them. Because the secret here is that when we can name our feelings, we activate our body's parasympathetic nervous system. Our bodies have two competing systems. The sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. Fight or flight, something happens, we activate, your whole body gets ready to go and run for our lives. The parasympathetic nervous system is its twin. That regulates our body. It calms us back down. Think parasympathetic like parachute. Um, and when we get emotionally activated, the parasympathetic nervous system will calm us down eventually on its own, but it works a lot better when it knows what it needs to calm down from. So when you say you're feeling out loud, you are putting yourself in a position to calm yourself down faster. So it's like, I'm angry. Okay, your body's going to calm down from anger. If you don't know what's going on, it's like, let's say I feel sweaty and uncomfortable and my mind is racing. Okay, I know this isn't what sadness feels like to me. I don't think I'm hungry. I don't think I'm sleepy. This is normally what worried feels like to me, but I'm not sure why I'm worried. Well, emotions aren't rational, right? So even if you can get close to it, naming your emotions is going to regulate your body a lot faster. And in psychology, we always say we name it to tame it. So when you name your emotions, it actually physically activates your body to calm down more. Now, it is incredibly difficult to catch a kid before they get upset because you might have multiple children, you might have multiple kids in your class or multiple kids in your therapy practice, or you've just got your own lives and you're responding to something on YouTube before you notice your kid was upset. If you can catch your kid before they accelerate, you can use this name your emotion thing to head the problems off at the pass. If you don't, and you're not going to do it every time, sometimes we have to let the behaviors peak. We have to just hold space and let them run themselves out of that emotion. Because when kids are really, really upset, when people are really, really upset, you can think about your brain as having two parts, the wizard brain and the lizard brain. So the wizard brain is the newest part of the brain. It sits on top of the lizard brain. The wizard brain is where our communication skills and coping skills are. So when we get really frustrated, that part of the brain goes, boy, it pops off because our brain thinks we're in danger and it's redirecting all of that emotional energy to the lizard brain, whose job it is to keep us alive. So think about the last time you saw someone who's really upset. Think about their eyes. Did it look like they were home? Probably not, because their brain is like, I'm in dire threat right now. I can't navigate this moment. All we can do is to hold space and they will start to de-escalate on their own eventually. Once they start to de-escalate, we can name the feeling to help them de-escalate faster. So you can use the name it to tame it on either side of the peak. But once kids start to melt down, sometimes the best you can do is sit with them, help keep them safe, and tell them that you're there and you love them. There's a lot of parenting skills here because kids need our help to regulate their feelings. We have big grown-up brains. They don't. So we got to model emotional behavior, like name your own feelings, talk to your kids through these feelings, being proactive whenever you can, figure out the things that cause your kids meltdowns and try and talk about them before they happen. Praise works so much better than punishment. When your kid melts down and has a behavior, they know they screwed up. They already feel bad. They don't need our help to feel worse, right? So we always praise the behavior we want to say. So I saw how hard you worked to keep it together. You were so brave to try that summer camp. I really appreciate you not using your hands for anger when you got mad. There's something you can praise, and if you can be authentic about that, that's going to go a long way. We also want to avoid shoulds. I always say that should is all the possibility of could plus shame. So when we move from you should be able to do this to you could be able to do this, you move from furious to curious. We don't want to be mad at our kids for something that they didn't do. Now, there are times where they absolutely know better and they could have done better. But you notice I even said could because could makes us curious. It's like, okay, we all know you could have passed that spelling test, but you didn't. So instead of yelling at you about it, let's get curious. What got in your way? And maybe it's like, well, I was up all night playing Super Smash Brothers, or I'm in a huge fight with my girlfriend, or I've been fighting a head cold, or I just didn't study for a bunch of different reasons. Knowing that information helps us make a better intervention in the future. Whereas if you scream at your kid, they're going to shut down and get defensive, and then we're not really in a position to help them out. I grew up on the Jersey Shore and I was a lifeguard for many summers. And one of the things that we always remember as lifeguards is that when somebody's in trouble, the most important thing you can do is bring something out into the water to help them. That's why you always see lifeguards with surfboards or those little buoys, because when somebody's struggling in the water, what they usually do is they grab you and now they're holding your arms and you have to swim with a panicking person. So if you can put them on the surfboard or give them a buoy or a life preserver, now they've got a chance to keep themselves afloat and you can pull them back in. So when we're parents, when we leap into the water to save our children, sometimes we put ourselves at risk. What is often better is to act not like the lifeguard, but act like the lighthouse. Be stable, be consistent, be a beacon, be something they can look to, because you're going to find that that is a far more productive strategy than leaping into the water to save every problem. Your kids can know where they are, they can know they trust you, and they can look to you because the lighthouse can call the Coast Guard if there's a problem, right? And when your kid knows who they are, they can use you to regulate themselves and get through things. And then community connection, right? So one of my favorite quotes that a lot of people say is it takes a village to raise a child. But the second part of that quote is just as important. It takes a village to support that child's parent. As we have become increasingly isolated in the society, we've lost a lot of community. We've lost a lot of people around us and with us who are helping us through these issues. So you're going to find summer camps or special school or therapy for your kid to help them navigate being neurodivergent, and that's wonderful. But make sure you find those things for you as well. One of my favorite ways to ask this question is if you were going on a road trip, how many books would you bring with you? Now, some people would say, no books. I'm going on a road trip. Why would I bring books? Some people would be like, well, I wouldn't bring a book. I'd bring a Kindle that has 6,217 books in it. Some people are like, I brought 5 paperbacks. But you want to go on a road trip with someone who's going to bring the same amount of books as you. When my wife and I went on our honeymoon, I remember my mom being like, well, why are you guys bringing books on your honeymoon? And we looked at each other like, because we want to read, right? I mean, a nice quiet night, in the hotel with a glass of wine, it's not a bad night, right? So you want to have people who have similar values and interests with you, but you won't know those things unless you ask those questions. So we want to learn things as we go. As we engage more, we're naturally going to learn more. And certain environments facilitate that kind of learning better than others. School is not so much about learning as it is about following directions. You did the things I asked you to do, good job at the end. To be in environments that allow kids to play as much soccer as they want, or write their own video games, or do dance, or in a play rehearsal, or a million things. We want things that encourage that deep exploration because we don't need to know everything before we get started. We need to be an environment that can teach us things as we go. Because when we find out more about the topic, we can go down rabbit holes, and that's not always a bad thing. We're going to learn more. And we know when kids are intrinsically motivated to learn about something, they learn more about it. Think about your own lives as a parent. If your partner comes up to you and says, I need you to, mow the lawn, and it's something you're just willing to do, you're not excited about it, you're just going to do it. But if your partner says to you, like, I think that we should get a home security system, and that's something you're interested in, you're going to research all those options yourself. You're like, what are the best options? What are the rates? What do they cover? What are the programs? You don't have to be push or spoon fed. You're learning these things on your own. and you can ask more questions as you learn more. You're constantly leveling up. So our kids communicate a lot of things to us through their interests, the shirts they wear, the books they read, how they spend their time. We want to listen to those things because those interests are going to tie us directly into communities that work best for our kids. Because having fun is important. I think kids are just so burned out because they're doing so many things. There's this race to get into college that starts in kindergarten. You need to be doing three extracurriculars and play a sport and learn a language and learn how to code and try and cure cancer. And it's like the work of childhood is play. We want kids to have more fun because through having fun, they're not only going to make more friends, they're actually going to learn more and retain it longer, right? If your kid struggles to make friends, making them play baseball because other kids play baseball is not really going to help them make friends. If your kid is super into geocaching, well, I want you to find a geocaching group because that's lowered the threshold for friendship because we know anybody who's going to give up their Saturday morning to tromp through the woods to find a tiny, FDMR transmitter, well, that's already your kind of person. In order to do this, we want to find things that are therapeutic that aren't necessarily therapy. Now, obviously, as a psychologist, I think therapy is a great thing, but it isn't for everybody. It's also hard to access. So, when you don't fit in easily with the world, you want to find places that help you feel like you fit. That can be homes, different kinds of schools, clubs, sports, summer camps, once again, therapy. But finding the right environments create what we call a virtuous cycle. Because when we feel better, we do better. And when we do better, we feel better. Competence builds confidence, and confidence builds competence, and competence builds confidence up and up and up we go. So the environment we're in makes a big difference. And it comes to this great quote from Ada Twist, scientist, which I'll read to you guys. Because at this point of the book, Ada has filled the whole hallway with all her questions and calculations. And instead of getting furious, her parents got curious and they wanted to learn more about it. So to support their kid, they said they started learning about the things Ada was interested in. And the quote says, because that's what you did, because that's what you do. When your kid has a passion and a heart that is true, they remade their world. Now they're all in the act of helping young Ada sort fiction from fact. She asked lots of questions. How could she resist? It's all in the heart of a young scientist. You know, our kids need us to open doors and give them access to things so they can do better because they want to do better. And when our kids do better, you'll find often that you do better as well. And then, of course, the other side is this is Calvin and his parents. What assurance do I have that your parenting isn't screwing me up? Well, here's the thing, guys. We don't actually know. We don't actually know if we're doing it right. And the one thing we know about parenting is you're going to screw up a lot. But as long as you approach parenting from a place of humility and you own your mistakes and you always are trying to learn and grow and you watch a video like this, the mistakes you make won't be permanent, right? As parents, we always write in pencil, right? Because we can erase our mistakes, we can try it again. When we live that kind of emotionally authentic, intellectually humble life, our kids not only see that, but they start to model it. And that's going to make them more productive, successful humans. So as you move forward, just remember, you're never going to get your kids' disruptive feelings or behaviors to zero. You know, teens are ornery, little kids are energetic, kids in their 20s can be very selfish. The idea is that we always measure behavior through what we call in psychology the big three: frequency, intensity, and duration. You want the disruptive stuff to happen less often, less intensely for shorter periods of time. You may never get it to zero, but you can get all those numbers smaller. If your kids meltdown or if they had that kind of feeling or behavior you've been trying to avoid, it doesn't mean you or your kids failed. This stuff is really hard. Progress is not linear, nor consistent, nor forever. If you've ever tried to lose weight, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're like, I've lost 20 pounds. And then it's like 3 weeks later, it's like, and it's back. Gifted kids are intellectual black holes. They may never feel full. You're going to go on a lot of trips to the library. You're going to have a million half-finished projects in your house because that's just how the brain works. Gifted kids' brains read boredom as pain. It literally triggers pain sensors in our brain. So our kids are going to work really hard to avoid being bored. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be at their beck and call, but it means redirecting them to a positive activity whenever possible. We want to help our kids build skills. Remember, we praise the behavior we want to see, and we will co-regulate with our kids so they can learn more and do better. And when in doubt, you talk it out. And that might mean apologize. I always like to ask parents at this point of the talk, when was the last time you apologized to your kid and meant it? Because it's easy to give a sort of surface level apology. Oh, like, I'm sorry. But like teens and gifted kids, especially neurodivergent kids, they're allergic to bullshit. If you don't mean it, they won't buy it. If you do mean it, they'll be much more likely to move on. So when in doubt, talk it out. So thank you guys so much for being a part of this. I know we covered a lot of ground very quickly. That is the nature of these recordings. But if you have other questions, here's how you track me down. We'd love to help you in your parenting journey. Thank you for being open to learning these sort of things and giving up your time. I hope it's helpful. If you have other questions, here's how you track me down. Thank you guys so much and have a great day. Take care.